Mr. Universe is an intriguing animal. I can't remember an episode of a TV show that gave me this much whiplash, except for maybe literally the next episode of this show. The events of this episode take place very soon after the events of the episode before it, where Steven was at the hospital with Dr. Maheshwaran. And I have to imagine at this point, because the doc was real upset at Greg for never having brought Steven to the doctor. I can't imagine she'd let Steven leave with Greg without giving him an earful about everything that Steven's been through, right? So I can't imagine he doesn't at least have some idea of what's going on with Steven. But they don't really acknowledge any of it specifically, though Greg does get the idea to take Steven on a journey of self-discovery, since he very much considers the stuff that brought him to where he is today to be a different journey of self-discovery. He even mentions in the episode that he didn't even know it was out there before he got the van. And by God, rewatching this episode for the review, the reprisal of Dear Old Dad at the beginning of this episode broke my heart. Because I've said before, I think Greg is still a positive force in Steven's life more often than a negative one. But this is when Steven needed him to finally step up. And he failed. And I'm not saying that everything that happened in this episode between them is his fault exclusively. Steven was to blame here too. Or he was responsible. I won't use the word blame, that's a little too harsh. Steven was responsible for what happened here too, and I'm going to talk about that. But Greg, the adult in the situation, should have had the emotional maturity to see that things were going wrong and at least recommend that they step back and start over, right? And he just didn't. The plot of the episode is that as they're journeying around on their journey of self-discovery, Greg gets the idea that he can recreate the moment that changed him into the person he is now for Steven, and hopefully that will give Steven direction in his life, new direction in his life. So they go back to Greg's family home, which is a very average suburban home. There's evidence around the place that his parents were perhaps a bit old-fashioned and conservative, but otherwise it's a perfectly average suburban American home. And they break in the way that Greg used to break back into the house after he would go to music gigs back when he was just starting out as a musician. Steven realizes where they are, and he is so delighted to be in a place that he's never been, where family that he's never known lives, able to learn about his father's past. But Greg's only concern is getting what he came for and getting out of there, and it's a CD. And they leave, and he plays the CD. A song called Mr. Universe, and it's an old-fashioned rock song. It's kind of cringy, even a little bit. And this is where he got his name from. And I can understand why the song would have been inspiring to him, right? Because he mentions he grew up without good music, which I assume he means rock music. Rock music is good. Don't get me wrong. So, I can understand why the song would have been inspiring to him, but it's just not what Steven needs. Steven doesn't need the same thing that Greg needed. That's the entire point of all of this. And when the song doesn't have the effect on Steven that Greg thought it would, and Steven starts to get irate, Greg just starts to play it over again. He just straight up doesn't get it. You know? He just doesn't get it. He doesn't get what the problem is. The episode started out, it sounded like he did. It sounded like he did. And I think if he hadn't gotten it through his head so early on that what Steven needed was exactly the same as what he needed, he would have come to a point where he actually understood and actually could have related. But again, I'll talk about this in a second. There's a certain amount of context here that is preventing him from doing that. So they get into it. Steven straight up brings up the fact that he's never been to school or to the doctor. But Greg insists that his parents were strict. They made him do things he didn't want to do. They made him cut his hair short when he didn't want to. They made him go to school and to the doctor and compete in sports. and things that he didn't enjoy. So he decided that he was going to give the same freedom that he discovered and now can't live it out to his son. And I've seen some people defending this choice because that's just how people are. Generation to generation, we tend to reflect the previous generation by rebelling against what our parents were and would have had us be, if that makes sense. And so this is a very natural sort of thing. It's a very realistic sort of story to tell. An entirely down-to-earth and conceivable scenario. But even if all of that is true, Greg still failed Steven. He just did. Just like any parent in the real world who rebels against their own parents by being super hands-off to the point that it is a detriment to their own children in terms of their own parenting, have failed their children too. You have to find a balance. And it seems now that Greg was just completely unconcerned with ever finding that balance for himself and Steven. And to be fair, Steven, the way he snaps back at Greg, it's clear that he's sort of idealized the opposite. He thinks that if he had more structure in his life, and structure is a common theme in this episode and the next one, and I'm going to be talking about it in both reviews, he seems to have gotten in his head that if he had all of that structure, if he had gone to school and he had gone to the doctor and he had lived in a house in the suburbs, then having that different life, I guess, is the best way to put it. He wouldn't have gone through all the things that he did that were so traumatic to him and are affecting him now. And also, you know, having gone to school, maybe he'd relate better to other humans and he'd have a way of connecting with new people and reconnecting with people that he's drifted apart from. And he wouldn't feel like everyone's drifting out of his life and that he's being left alone. There would be options to remedy that he doesn't feel that he has now. Like, if you think about it, all of Steven's problems throughout this entire arc of the show, the entirety of Steven Universe Future, in fact, stem from the fact that what structure he did have has suddenly disappeared. People needing him, people relying on him on a regular and consistent basis for similar kinds of things, that's a kind of structure. Being in a relationship, solidifying that relationship through marriage, that's a kind of structure. Even working at Little Homeschool in the beginning was him clearly searching for structure, and when he didn't find it there, he moved on without any idea of where he needed to move on to find what he was actually looking for. And I think that's the thing that I hate about this episode the most. I don't hate this episode, to be clear, but I hated this thing about this episode, that at the start of their journey of self-discovery together, Steven and Greg, they were getting along so well, and Steven seemed to be doing so much better because at the very least he was searching, and he had someone there who was supportive, someone who cared about him, someone who could just be there for him. I think if they had just kept doing that for a while, maybe Steven would have eventually figured out what he needs and would have been able to move on without everything that came next. But I don't think Greg is emotionally mature enough that he ever would have realized that. I think that Greg took Steven on that journey expecting that there would be a clear end goal in sight relatively early, because when Greg was a teenager and he heard that Mr. Universe song, he knew what he wanted from that day forward. The journey came later for him. And I think that got in the way of him recognizing that for Steven, the journey was what was important and not the destination. The problem is that while it's entirely valid to listen to a David Bowie song and suddenly understand what you want from life, that's not gonna work for everybody. And Greg, like people who have always criticized Greg, calling him essentially a man-child, were kind of right. He realized who he wanted to be as a teenager and or / whatever, young adult around that age group. And while he has certainly stepped up in some ways since then, like, he's not terrible with Steven on a day-to-day basis, and he got a job to support Steven, right? That's a thing that he did. He clearly didn't want to do it, but he did it. he never really grew beyond that point. He's still that kid to this day. The problem is, he thought that just leaving Steven to his own devices all those times as a kid was affording him the freedom that Greg himself never had, and that's just not the case. That's not freedom. All he's doing is he's imposing his own lifestyle onto Steven the same way that Greg's parents imposed their lifestyle on him. It's just his lifestyle looks more free on paper. But just as his parents got in their heads that there were certain things that they needed to do as parents and that their child needed to do as a child, Greg got it through his head that freedom is what he considers freedom to be, and that the best thing for his child would be to experience that for their entire life. If he really cared, though, about Steven having true freedom, he would have given Steven the opportunity to gather the information he needed to make his own choices about things. He would have sent Steven to school, but he would have talked to him about it at every stage, guiding Steven towards asking himself the right questions to determine whether or not school was for him. If not going to school was an option in Greg's book, then going to school had to be an option too. And it's often surprising. I won't say shocking, but it's often surprising to parents when they discover just how well equipped even young children are to make choices about themselves, informed choices about themselves, and who they want to be, assuming that they have enough information to do so reliably. And I've seen people argue that Steven, with his emerging powers and his responsibilities as a crystal gem, school might have been a bad thing for him, because school was stressful. But first of all, Connie's done really good in school. It doesn't seem like she has all the same stress issues that kids in the real world tend to have when they've gone through the absolutely dog shit American education system. So I would say at best, we can't assume that the American education system in Steven's world is as objectively terrible as the one in ours. And also, going to school, especially if you end up in good classes with good teachers, can teach you time management and stress management techniques that Steven could be making use of right now. And also, going to school, he would have had, ideally at least, access to a counselor and to a nurse who could have assessed his health occasionally, because Greg still never sent him to a frickin' doctor. And I'm always going to be mad about that. I care about this character enough that I'm probably going to die mad about that. Greg uses the excuse in this very episode that Steven was a gem. He's not like other kids. But that's even more reason to send him to a doctor. Yeah, there would have been some worry there that somebody would have freaked out seeing a rock fused to Steven's stomach. But this is a world, keep in mind, this is a world where alien stuff is everywhere, and people are very blasé about it. Remember that episode where Dr. Maheshwaran brought gem-forced fusions into her hospital with gems fused to their bodies and assumed that they were just accident patients? I'm fairly certain they could have spun something that would have kept the doctors off their back about Steven having a rock in his belly and still gotten him adequate medical care over the years. Because being half alien, you have absolutely no idea what health concerns he might have. It's absolutely asinine that apparently Greg was able to dismiss the possibility that his child might need medical help so easily and so early on, it seems. The implication is that this is a decision that he came to extremely early on in Steven's life, maybe even before Steven was born. And I'm sorry, at that point, it stops being a reason and it becomes an excuse, and Greg just seems like he didn't want to deal with it. He seems lazy, and that makes me mad. And I get it, I don't want to downplay the negative effects that a strict parenting can have on you, but I also want to play up the effects that an overly laissez-faire parenting can have on you. Because, surprise, surprise, I'm one of those people who has experienced both sides of the fence. I had separated parents, my dad was very strict, and my mom sometimes, just to spite my dad, would let me and my siblings get away with stuff that he never would have. I was emotionally mature enough as a child to recognize that I needed to find some balance between those two things. I eventually came to that realization. So, I like to think that I grew up to be fairly well adjusted, and yet I still carry baggage from that time in my life. Not to mention that I had to grow up way faster than I wanted to because I had to be my emotional rock. I had to be my own emotional stability when it should have been my parents who were. So I feel like I missed out on a lot of stuff that I should have experienced that I never will now. I actually understand completely where Steven is coming from here. I am just as guilty as he is of looking at someone else's childhood, someone else's young adulthood, someone else's teenage years, and idealizing them, even the faults, even the things that I probably wouldn't have enjoyed in the moment if I had experienced them naturally, because I never got to experience them at all. I never even had the option. The fact that Greg didn't give Steven the option, that he didn't seem to care that the option might be important to Steven, he limited his own son's freedoms. Freedom of choice is still a freedom. But at the end of the day, I don't want to sit here comparing the two characters' traumas. I don't want to sit here comparing any two traumas, because the point of the episode seems to be that trauma is trauma, and you shouldn't sit there comparing your trauma with somebody else's and trying to one-up them. Because I didn't even talk about the end of the episode yet, did I? Steven gets irate with Greg and rips the steering wheel off and they crash. But they're both fine. But in that moment leading up to that, Greg doesn't understand that what Steven needs isn't the same thing that he needed back then. But Steven also gets hung up on the fact that he doesn't think that what Greg went through was as traumatic as what he's been through. What they needed there was to just step back, listen to each other, and even if they didn't entirely understand, not to belittle each other's experiences, to recognize that each of their experiences are valid, and then work from there to try to figure out how their shared experience can lead them to discovering what it is that Steven actually needs. But Greg got roadblocked in that moment by the fact that he got it through his head that Steven needed the same thing that he did, and Steven likewise got roadblocked by the fact that Greg couldn't admit that maybe he had made mistakes when raising Steven. It's heartbreaking is still a good word for it, I think. It's heartbreaking. Because if Greg had just taken that step back enough to recognize that what he was doing wasn't helping, everything could have been different. But if Steven, in that moment, had been able to channel Kid Steven and understand where Greg was coming from, and where Greg couldn't ask for them to start the conversation over, things also could have been different. I don't know what else to say about this one. So that's actually not true. I have other things I could say about this episode. This review is going to end with things having been left unsaid. I came to peace with that back when I was trying to work out exactly how to say literally everything that I feel needs to be said about this episode. But I feel like, in terms of reviewing the episode itself, I've said enough. The rest of it we can work through as part of a discussion in the comments, maybe, hopefully. Or I can rant about it in a discussion-style video like Steven and His Guardians was, or something. I don't know. Point is, this episode, by design, was very painful to watch. It felt very real and very raw. And I relate to both of the core characters in this episode. And I wish that they had been able to both be better. But at the same time, I find it completely believable that they weren't. Because similar situations like this happen so often in the real world. Even just to me. I get it. So while it was hard to watch, it was still extremely compelling just because it was so relatable. Though I will say that because it was so relatable, and perhaps because this is a thing that I care about, like parent-child relationships and bringing up children, child rearing in general, that's something that I care about. It's something I read a lot about in general. The episode didn't surprise me much at all. Like, I kind of hoped that Greg's upbringing would be revealed to be, like, worse, but at the same time, I don't actually wish it had been worse, because I still like Greg as a character and don't want him to have gone through worse. And again, not to downplay how damaging strict parenting can be. I don't know. I just... It's too normal. It feels too normal. There's no big extenuating circumstance that made Greg the emotionally immature person he is now. It's just normal stuff that anyone... It's a normal pitfall that anyone can fall into. And that's such a bold choice to make, because I'm so much more disappointed in Greg than I had to be here. If the writers had made a different choice and there had been some big extenuating circumstance to explain why Greg is the way he is, I wouldn't feel so disappointed in him. And yet I still like him. He's still a likable guy, and I still think he means the best. And so I still want good things for the character. You know, it's so good. That's such a hard balance to maintain, especially when taking such a risk in making him so normal. This episode's very good. Very painful to watch. Especially that reprisal of Dear Old Dad at the start. And yet it's so good. Though it's not one that I ever plan to revisit very often, I think. It hits a little too close to home, if you know what I mean. All of that said, though, guys, let's get that discussion that I mentioned earlier going in the comment section down below. Start by telling me what you thought of the episode Mr. Universe, if you have seen it. Either way, though, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.